Yesterday was the dinosaur deck's turn, now it's the merfolk. Today we're going to go ahead and try to upgrade the explorers of the deep precon coming with Lost Caverns of Ixalan and see how we can do with that. Now I've done merfolk decks in the past with Kumena Tyrant of Araska as the front-facing commander, but let's see how this deck plays out. I think it's going to play slightly differently than how that variation does. As I said, I've done merfolk before in the past, but with the commanders that are included in this deck, I think it's going to play out just a little bit differently. Let's take a look here. First is Hawkball of the Surging Soul, which is the face commander of the deck. 2 green and a blue for a 3/3 Merfolk Scout. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each Merfolk you control explores. That means you reveal the top card of your library, put the card in your hand if it's a land, otherwise put a counter on the exploring creature, and then put the card either back on top or put it in your graveyard. When Hawkball, the Surging Soul, attacks, you can put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you don't, draw a card. So like Kumena, this actually has the ability to put +1/+1 counters on our Merfolk, but unlike him, we don't have to rely on tapping multiple Merfolk down in order to get the effects off of it and play other spells that untap our stuff off turn and those kind of things. So we can kind of focus the deck more into the combat part of it rather than trying to bulk our stuff up first and then attack. So this is just kind of like a static bulking boost for us. And then on top of it has its own built-in card drawing engine because you don't have to put the land into play. You're not like required to do that. So if you need the cards, you can just draw the cards instead, and you can just keep bulking up your stuff as you go along with the explorers. The other exclusive commander to this precon is Zotoak, the Smiling Flood. For a 4, a green and a blue, you get a 6/6 Salamander Serpent. Says whenever Zotoak, the Smiling Flood, enters the battlefield or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. That land becomes an island in addition to its other types as long as it has a flood counter on it. And at the beginning of your end step, untap each permanent you control with a counter on it. So you have a couple of different things you can do here. You can put a flood counter on one of your opponent's lands to turn it into an island in addition, and then that works with Island Walk and other abilities that several merfolk in the game have, so you can swing through without being able to be blocked. You also have the option to put in the flood counters on your own lands, which does 2 purposes in and of itself. One, if you put it on a green land, you actually turn it into a dual land of green-blue. And on top of that, you have the benefit of being able to untap those lands during the beginning of your end step. So you'll have that mana freed up for instant speed interactions as well. A third option that's included in the precon but is not exclusive to this deck because it comes from the main set is Nizil Current Conductor. Green blue 2/3 Merfolk Scout. Whenever a creature you control explores a land card, you can put the land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. And whenever a creature you control explores a non-land card, put a +1/+1 counter on Nizil Current Conductor. So this actually goes hand in hand with the front-facing commander with making all your merfolk explore. Because if you have, say, 5 merfolk on the board and they all start exploring at the beginning of that upkeep off the other commander, then what happens is you're going to get 5 explore triggers, and this card, Nizil, is going to look at all of those explore triggers and go, okay, oh, there's a land, I can put it on the battlefield. Oh, it's a non-land, she gets a counter. And you just kind of shift it back and forth. And then she herself would also explore off of Hackball's trigger. Now, moving away from the legendary face cards that could possibly run this deck, let's take a look at Merfolk Cave Diver. For 2 and a blue, it's a 2/4 Merfolk Scout from the main set. It's actually included in the precon, and it says whenever a creature you control explores, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked. Now, I was just talking about how Nizil works really well with Hawkball's trigger of making all of your merfolk explore. Well, this is a really good card with Hawkball because for every merfolk that explores at the beginning of your turn, this is going to get +1/+0 off of it, and then it can't be blocked. So again, if you have 5 merfolk on the board, they all explore. This is going to get +5/+0 and can't be blocked until end of turn and take a nice swipe out of somebody's life total in the process, making it a very powerful option as long as you're running one of the explorer commanders like this at the front. Another new card from the precon is Ripples of Potential. For 1 and a blue, you get an instant that says proliferate, then choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter put on this way. Those permanents phase out. So this is a new way of protecting your creatures from board wipes and things of that nature. Now, what I like about this card in general is I like it better. It has a little extra hoop to jump through versus something that makes all your stuff indestructible and hexproof or whatever, because this gets around exile removal and negative removal. So your farewells, your sunfalls, your meathook massacres, all that stuff, this actually saves your creature still because those other spells get around the indestructible and hexproof part of the spells. Whereas this, you phase out your stuff and it makes your stuff bigger in the process by proliferating the counters on them. So the only hoop you got to jump through is to make sure they have a +1/+1 counter on them before that board wipe is set off. Next, we have a very punny named card, but it's also quite good in this deck. Wave Goodbye. For 2 blue blue, you get a sorcery. Return each creature without a +1/+1 counter on it to its owner's hand. Well, the whole point of this deck is to use Hawkball's ability to explore, put counters on things, and we have other things that spread counters around as well. So all your stuff theoretically should be able to dodge this, and all your opponent's stuff, for the most part, or at least most of it, is going to get bounced back to their hand if they're not focusing up on +1/+1 counter synergies. And in doing so, you're going to clear the road and you're going to be able to smash through with your Merfolk and win the game that way. Now, this card I hadn't seen until this morning when I was looking to figure out my cuts for this deck. This is Deep-Root Historian. For 3 and a green, you get a 3/3 Merfolk Druid that says Merfolk and Druid cards in your graveyard have retrace. Retrace means you pay the casting cost of the spell from your graveyard and then discard a land card, and then you can bring it back into play or cast. Retrace is usually on instants and sorceries, and sometimes enchantments. It's kind of varied. This is actually, I think, one of the first variants that I've seen of creature spells gaining the ability. But this is very, very powerful, because you're able to recycle your stuff from the graveyard that got wiped out. As long as it wasn't exiled, you're able to just go ahead and bring it back over and over and over again. So if your opponents are killing your stuff, as long as this sticks around, you're able to get it back from the yard as long as you have a land in hand to pitch to the retrace. We also have Topography Tracker. For 2 and a green, you get a 2/2 Merfolk Scout that says when it enters the battlefield, create a map token. If a creature you control would explore, it instead explores and then explores again. So this actually takes Hawkball's ability at the beginning of the turn and just jacks it way up through the roof, because you're going to get double explore every turn as a default as long as he's out and this thing is sitting there. So your Merfolk are going to grow really, really quick, especially if you know what's sitting on top of your deck. You're able to scry into it, or like you reveal and go, oh, it's a non-land card. You're just like, okay, I just reveal the same card over and over and over again, and just bulk my stuff up and attack. Then we have Tributary Instructor. For 3 and a green, you get a 4/4 Merfolk Shaman with Mentor that says whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. So, creatures are going to die in combat, or they're going to get blown up by removal or whatever. But at least with this card, you're going to have counters on your things. You're going to have ways of basically replacing that creature dying by getting the card draw trigger off of this. And it has the ability to mentor and put a +1/+1 counter on smaller creatures. So even if we're exploring across the board, as long as this thing is a little bit bigger than something else that's attacking, it can add an additional counter to it with the mentor ability. Then we have a card that allows us to try to dodge mass removal and other things going on with our opponents. Singer of the Swift Rivers. For 1 green blue, you get a 3/2 Merfolk Shaman with Flash. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, put a shield counter on another target creature you control. You may cast Merfolk spells as though they had Flash. So this has a built-in protection mode attached to it. So if someone's going to destroy something important, you can flash this in and stop them from destroying it with the shield counter. And you can cast your other Merfolk spells as though they had Flash as well. So you have ways of flashing this in and then being able to flash in some of your other stuff to kind of go around. People are like, well, they're not going to wipe the board just yet because you don't have enough. And all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'll flash in like 2 or 3 Merfolk. Now your board's big enough, and then you untap and they're already past their summoning sickness because you did it at the end of the last turn. So there's some functionality here that's really good with the Merfolk, and I really like this card. And then the last new card I wanted to point out from the Precon is Mist Dancer. For 4 and a blue, you got a 3/3 Merfolk Wizard with Flying. Other Merfolk you control get +1/+0 and have Flying, and it has Encore of 5 blue. You can exile this card from the graveyard, and then for each of your opponents, you can create a token copy that attacks the opponent this turn if able, and they gain haste. Sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, and you can only do this on your turn as a sorcery. So the big thing here is giving the Merfolk Flying, in my eyes, because you're able then to give it an evasion ability, which is harder to deal with because most creatures do not fly. So you're going to be able to get your stuff up and over your opponent's lines. The pump is really nice. And then if you need a big finish at the end of the game, you can encore this thing for 7 out of your yard, and it's going to give +3/+0 in flying to all your stuff, because you're going to have 3 copies of it come in for each of the opponents as long as all the players are still in the game. And then they're going to all fly over and swing and smash. So I really like this card. I think it's kind of a cool way to get through without just saying all your stuff's unblockable, because at least then it does give the opponent a chance to survive it if they have flyers, but if not, they're just going to get run over by a bunch of flying merfolk. So that was all the new stuff that's coming. So let's take a look at some of the reprints that are coming in this thing. Now, it's not quite as good as what was coming in the dinosaur deck, but there's still quite a few things that are quite expensive still currently, and have only seen one printing. So now we're going to get new reprints with new art on some of this stuff. So let's take a look. So first up is a card that is usually only reserved for merfolk decks, but it also works well just in any kind of deck with a +1/+1 counter synergy and it has blue. Herald of Secrets streams for 3 and a blue. You get a 2/3 merfolk warrior. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. So, again, this is usually reserved for this kind of deck, but it works well either direction. And I love this card because it's like as soon as you get a counter on there, you're not blocking it, and then they have to deal with you. If they can't deal with you, you're going to destroy them long before they ever get anything else set up. Then there's Kindred Discovery for 3 blue blue, an enchantment that says when it enters, choose a creature type. Whenever a creature you control of the type chosen enters the battlefield or attacks, draw a card. This is an immense card draw engine for anything that is dedicated to a creature type. So in this case, you name Merfolk, and you just keep on plowing through and drawing cards. Now, this just got reprinted in the Commander Master set, but it's still holding a pretty decent price tag of around $7 to $8. So it's great to see that they're going to go ahead and reprint this and give us some good value here off of this card. Then we have another card that's kind of surprising for its price. It's Rapid Hybridization. For a blue, you get an instant that destroys target creature. It can't be regenerated. The creature's controller generates a 3/3 frog lizard creature token. I was kind of shocked to see this is actually like a $3 to $4 uncommon. And even though it's had several printings in the last few years, people just use this a lot in blue, so it's very heavily wanted, and it's a great reprint to see here and saves you some money if you're buying the precon. Next is a card that has only ever been printed in the original Lorwyn block, and that is Surge Spanner. For 2 blue blue, you get a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard that says when it becomes tapped, pay 1 in the blue. If you do, return target permanent to its owner's hand. Right now, this is going for around $5 to $6, but I remember when I was actually building my Kumena deck, this was going for around $12 to $15 at the time, because it had only been printed in the Lorwyn block, and Merfolk were actually quite popular back when I built the deck originally. So this commanded a bigger premium. Nowadays, it's not quite as much. And since this is included in the precon, it won't spike nearly as hard as what happened with the Kumena phase back in Ixalan block. Now, this is a card that's good for just about any deck where you want to focus on a creature type. It's Metallic Mimic. For 2 colorless, you get a 2/1 artifact shapeshifter that says as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. It is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and each other creature you control with the chosen type that when it enters the battlefield, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. So this card is, believe it or not, is about a $9 to $10 card right now. Aether Revolt was the original printing, and it's seen a couple other minor prints, but this is great for just about anything. Vampires, merfolk, goblins, you name it. This card should probably be played in those decks. So this is a good card to have around regardless of if you're going to play it in this deck or not. And it's really good in this deck because we want the +1/+1 counters on our merfolk. So it's a great addition in the deck, and I love that they have it here. They've also included Realm Walker. For 2 and a green, you get a 2/3 shapeshifter with Changeling. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You may look at the top card of your library at any time and cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of your library. So this allows us to pick merfolk, play them off the top, and I like that they included it here because it's actually a $4 card, even though it's, kind of relegated to only in green, but it's also, again, a great card to use if you're playing any sort of creature type matters deck, to include this to start casting them off the top of their deck, because you could even slot this into the dinosaur deck as well and just play dinosaurs off the top along with the merfolk that this is intended for. Now, you heard me mention him earlier in the video. Kumena Tyrant of Araska is in the precon as well. For 1, a green and a blue, you get a 2/4 Merfolk Shaman. Tap another untapped Merfolk you control. Kumena can't be blocked this turn. Tap 3 untapped that you control, draw a card, and tap 5 untapped Merfolk you control. Put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk you control. All right, did you catch all that? That was a big book of stuff that going on with that card. This thing is really, really good. It was great as the front-facing commander. My only qualm with it is you kind of have to sit back. Unless you have ways of untapping your stuff with like a Seedborn Muse or something like that, you had to kind of sit on this thing. Now, when I played the deck, this was before they banned Paradox Engine. I had Paradox Engine in this deck exclusively to tap down my stuff and untap it during my opponent's stuff by playing spells. so I could keep doing the whole +1/+1 counters or draw card type synergies with the Merfolk, and it was kind of nutty. Now we don't have access to that because it's now banned, so Commander is probably not nearly as good as the front face, so that's kind of why I like having other options for my Merfolk decks, but this is still a really, really good card in this deck. And it actually still commands a pretty decent price of around $7 to $8 right now, so it's nice to have. Now, here comes the card that has the most value coming out of this precon, and it has brand new art attached to it for the Ixalan stuff. Branching Evolution for 2 and a green, you get an enchantment that says if one or more +1/+1 counters be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. So this card right now only had one single printing in the original Jumpstart set, and that thing's going for around $18 to $20 right now. So this right here makes up a massive bulk of the reprint value going into this deck. Again, like I said earlier, this does not include as much reprint equity as there is in the dinosaur deck, but this is a really good card. Anytime you are playing +1/+1 counter synergies, you should be probably running this card alongside of Doubling Season and anything else that's going on. Now, I'm not going to include Doubling Season in this deck because I've included that in a lot of decks and I'm trying to branch out into some other cards. And since this is already in this deck, we go ahead and we already have a counter doubler here, and I don't need to include it. So those are the cards that are included in the Precon, new and reprinted. So what am I adding to this deck? Well, let's take a look at those cards now. The cards that I cut out of the deck, they're going to be down below in the description. And while you're down there, if you want, go ahead and please comment on the deck, like, subscribe, all that good fun stuff. And let's move on to what I'm adding to this deck. First off, let's dip into the new main set cards. Deep Fathom Echo for 2, a green and a blue. You get a 4/4 Merfolk Spirit. At the beginning of combat on your turn, it explores. Then you may have it become a copy of another creature you control until end of turn. So I like clones. If anybody's been around on the channel long enough, I've stated that several times now. And this is kind of like a weird Merfolk clone that can change itself turn after turn as long as you have stuff. But it only targets your own stuff, which is fine because sometimes we want multiple copies of some of our Merfolk. Like I wouldn't mind having extra copies of Merfolk, Mistbinder, or one of the other Lord type cards like Mirror Regery or something of that nature to help bolster up our forces. On top of that, this thing explores, which goes hand in hand with the Explore synergies of the deck. So I thought it'd be a great include here. Next, I want to dip into a little bit of Merfolk trickery here with Harbinger of the Tides. For blue, you get a 2/4 Merfolk Wizard that if you can cast it as though it had flash if you pay 2 extra to cast it. And then when it enters the battlefield, you can return a target tapped creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So this has a couple different things going for it. If they have a creature with a tapped activated ability that's really bothersome, you can bounce it in response to the activation, and then as long as it's still tapped, it'll return to its hand, or you can take out a troublesome blocker. Let's say they have a Blightsteel Colossus breathing down your throat. This is a great way to bounce that thing back to their hand and get it off your back for at least a turn. And it's a great card just to kind of do some things for us. You can also mess around with like political trickery here. Like maybe somebody wants to reuse an ETB effect off their stuff. They can make a deal with you and you'd be like, hey, I can help you get that out again to help take care of this other troublesome player, but you have to attack me with it. And you're like, okay, they attack you, and then you bounce it, and then it goes back to the hand. And now you're like, now you can recast it and do what you need to do. So there's some different things you can do with this card, and I really like these kind of effects in the deck. Then we have one of my favorite cards that turned into a real problem child when Paradox Engine was still around. It's Mage Mentor. For 1 blue, you get a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may put a 1/1 blue Merfolk creature token onto the battlefield. Tap 7 untapped Merfolk you control to counter target spell. Now, this deck does not have much in the way, if any, counterspell magic in it. However, if you have enough Merfolk, this creates a counter for us, and you're just able to go ahead and counter a spell. So, like, if someone's casting a board wipe or whatever, that's a great time to tap your 7 Merfolk and stop them from blowing you out on the game. Now, I'm kind of surprised they did not include this in the precon, but it's Jadelight Ranger. For 1 green, and you get a Merfolk Scout 2/1 that when it enters the battlefield, it explores, then it explores again. This was one of the best cards coming out of that set for Standard, and it's still a pretty good card in Commander. And again, I'm just kind of surprised they didn't include it because it's kind of like, this is almost like an Explore deck. Like, that's kind of the point of the deck. So I had to include it here. And speaking of the Explore kind of being the point, Jadelight Spelunker from the new main set, X and a green, 1/1 Merfolk Scout. When it enters the battlefield, it explores X times. So you pay the X and then it explores that many times. So you could theoretically have a 1/1 for, 5 in a green or whatever. But then again, you could also have a 6/6 if you just find your one non-land on the top and just be like boom, boom, boom 6 times. So this thing scales with the game, so you can play it early and get some good stuff going on, or you can play it late and get some good stuff. Either way, this is a good card for the deck. Now, with all the Explorer that's included in the deck, I needed to put a little more synergy in here, so we're going to stick in Wild Growth Walker. For 1 and a green, you get a 1/3 elemental that says whenever a creature you control explores, put a +1/+1 counter on Wild Growth Walker, and you gain 3 life. So if you have a group of Merfolk out with your commander and they all are exploring, you're going to put several counters on this and gain several chunks of life, which also acts as a great recovery tool if you've been getting beat on during the earlier parts of the game. Now, while this card is not from Ixalan, it does feature art of Ixalan Merfolk. It's Mist Caller. For a blue, you get a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard. Sack the Mist Caller until end of turn. If a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it was not cast, exile it instead. Now, I was not going to include this, but then I thought about the dinosaur deck with all of its Discover tricks and Gishath and all this other stuff. So if you're playing an upgraded variation of this deck against an upgraded variation of the dinosaur deck, this is a really good card because if they discover something into play or they use Gishath to try to smash you in the face and then get a bunch of free dinos off of it, all you gotta do then is pop this and they get nothing because all of it gets exiled. Another card I was kind of surprised was not in the deck is Mcloed Heral from the original Rivals of Ixalan set. For a blue, you get a 1/1 Merfolk Warrior that cannot be blocked. This thing is great for dumping counters on top of, because then you just have a threat that is just slowly eating away at their life total, and eventually they have to deal with this little 1/1 dork, or it's going to kill them. And then again, same thing with River Sneak here. For 1 and a blue, it's a 1/1 Merfolk Warrior that can't be blocked. And whenever another Merfolk enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So if you're able to chain Merfolk casts or get Merfolk tokens off of things as you play the game, and then you just swing with this thing can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it is unblockable. And again, it's something that they will have to deal with one way or the other, or it will eventually destroy them. Next, I wanted a little more protection for our commander and other important pieces of the deck, so I included Swift Warden from the original Ixalan. For 1 green, you get a Merfolk Warrior with Flash. It says, when it enters the battlefield, target Merfolk you control gains hexproof until end of turn. Because, target removal is a heavy duty thing in the game, and you want to keep your stuff from getting blown out. So this is just a great way to flash this in, stop them from destroying something, and it gives you a decent sized body in the process. Going hand in hand with our unblockable Merfolk that I mentioned just a bit ago, let's go with True Name Nemesis. For 1 blue, you get a 3/1 Merfolk Rogue. As it enters the battlefield, choose a player. The True Name Nemesis has protection from the chosen player. That means they can't block it, they can't target it, they can't enchant it with anything. There's nothing they can do to this card other than mass remove it off the board. The last 3 cards I'm going to include here all come from the new main set. Let's first look at Deeproot Pilgrimage. For 1 and a blue, you get an enchantment that whenever 1 or more non-token Merfolk you control become tapped, create a 1/1 blue Merfolk creature with hexproof. So if you have a way of tapping your stuff down, Kumena, or you're attacking, you're going to get extra Merfolk tokens off of this in order to bolster your board out, and then it gives you things that you can actually dump counters onto, and this just has great synergies going across the board with this deck. Then we have one of the more talked about cards that people in like CDH and Modern are talking about. It's Tishana's Tidebinder. For 2 and a blue, you get a 3/2 Merfolk Wizard with Flash that says when it enters the battlefield, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If an ability on an artifact creature or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as you control the Tidebinder on the battlefield. So this is just a really good card in general, but there's some things that you just really want to shut off and keep them from screwing with you, like the One Ring, which is why the Modern players are so excited about this thing. But you're able to counter the protection trigger on the One Ring, and then the One Ring loses that ability. The ability is countered, and then it loses the ability to put burden counters on it and draw them cards. It becomes a paperweight when this thing hits it. It also does that kind of thing to things like Orcish Bowmasters, or there's all kinds of triggered abilities and activated abilities this thing can shut off. So this is a great card to include in this deck, and you're going to find targets for this thing to shut down. And then the last card I wanted to include here is Twists and Turns. For a green, you get an enchantment that says if a creature you control would explore, instead you scry one, then they explore. Then Twists and Turns enters the battlefield, target creature you control explores, and when a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, you transform Twists and Turns. It flips over into Mcloed Maze. It taps for a green, or you can pay 3 and a green and tap it to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put that card under your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So it's cool that we can dig through the deck and try to get extra stuff out of it. What I like here is the fact that you get to scry before you get to do the stuff. Now, you do not have a choice on transforming Twists and Turns. So if you play the land after this and you're at 7 or more, you're gonna have to flip it over. So there's kind of the tension here where you're gonna have to, if you want to keep this, you're not gonna be able to play lands. But if you need to play land, you're going to lose Twists and Turns. So there's some push and pull here. I like this card, but I want to see how it plays out. It may not stay in the deck because it may just cause too many headaches as I'm working with the deck. So that's what I have for you guys today. That was the Merfolk deck. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, all that good fun YouTube stuff. And I'll see you in the next video, which I do believe is going to be the Vampire deck.